Hello, welcome to Chapter 7 for Geography 101. Today we start looking at economic geography. And we're actually going to cover this in a couple chapters, but today we're going to start with this idea of the three different sectors of the economic geography. So we'll go through all these different concepts. Let's get right into it. The book breaks economic activity, right, things that we do for money or for need or for gain, in three different sectors, kind of like this triangle right here, right? Three different sectors: primary, secondary, tertiary. The primary and secondary sectors are the base, right? And so that's the base of economic activity. We don't see the tertiary or the cap in every economy. We see this more in more mature economies. So an example would be the United States or England versus Uganda or Guatemala. As an economy grows and becomes wealthier and powerful, we see the tertiary sector grow, but it all begins here with the base. Now, this may look very simple and complex. Understand that all three sectors are basically tied in there's many different flows, connections, networks. It's very complex. It's not just this simple cut and dry. But we'll talk about these three sectors. But basically speaking, the primary sector is basic production, actual obtaining resources, so farming, lumber, mining. The secondary sector is making things out of those materials, so taking the food and making processed food, taking lumber or trees that you cut and making them into furniture. And then the tertiary sector are services, so banks, medical care, education, things that don't involve an actual physical thing that you make. So let's get into this. You can actually see how it kind of ties into the idea of a mature economy. In 1978, in China, of all the economic activity in the country, the primary aspect, right, the base level, accounted for 28% of the economic activity, whereas the service sector was 23%. By the way, in 1978, China was still one of the poorest countries in the world. The average income in China was less than almost every country in Africa. Look at today, 2015. Now, the primary sector is less than 6%, so a big drop. And the service sector has changed. It is now almost half, or a little over half, of the economic activity is service materials, right? And think about today. Today, China has the second largest economy in the world and one of the highest standards of living. So you can see that they underwent a rapid change reflected here in this makeup. So let's get into detail. So the primary sector, like I said, kind of the base level. This is just the base obtaining of materials that we talked about, raw materials. So fishing, mining, farming, getting the actual raw materials out of the ground. And this is heavily dependent on geography. Think about agriculture, right? To grow certain crops, you need certain types of climate. We don't see Chicago as a major banana producer. It's just not warm enough, right? What does Illinois grow a lot of? Corn and soybeans, right? The right climate, the right weather. So that's a very geographically dependent. One thing they talk about, this idea of the wheat belt. It's this belt of land around the world, basically where Chicago is, that's just far north and not too far south, where you can grow wheat the best. So this is countries like the United States, Russia, the Ukraine, Europe. And so in that part of the world, agriculture is a very big part of the economy. Up until about the 1920s, we were still one of the largest agricultural countries in the world. Areas like Pennsylvania have a large amount of rock that is near the surface that can be quarried to make gravel. It is a very important aspect of their economy. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Bahrain all have large deposits of oil. So that is definitely dependent on their location over these resources, right? Now, the global markets shape production. How we use these products is shaped by the global market. So, for instance, right now, the United States is still one of the largest producers of corn. We grow more corn than almost anybody else. But people aren't eating as much corn. We grow more corn than we need to eat. And so some of it goes to feed animals, like cows and pigs. Some of it gets sold to other countries, but a large amount of our corn harvest is actually turned into corn syrup, which can be used to sweeten foods cheaper than regular sugar. And that's a relatively new development because of the demand for processed food. But let's look at sugar production itself. So sugar production, we go back before corn syrup. We go back to the 1600s, and sugar was grown on a few islands in the Mediterranean Sea near Europe. Uh, the people like sugar. Humans have a natural sweet tooth. We are programmed to like sweet food, and sugar was very profitable. One of the things that drove European colonization of the Caribbean, of Cuba, of Brazil, of all of the islands of the Caribbean was they were great locations, right, for sugar plantations. The right temperature, the right amount of rain. Now, when they first started trying to grow sugar in Cuba and in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, sugar takes a lot of labor. And so they tried to use the local Native Americans as labor workers, but the Native Americans, as we talked about, often succumbed to illness and died. And so there was this demand for labor to feed the sugar plantations, and that was one of the main drivers of the slave trade. Most of the slaves brought from Africa to the New World did not go to North America to pick cotton. They actually went to Brazil to grow sugar. They went to Cuba, Barbados, all these islands in Haiti. And this drove sugar production because it was profitable. But what happens? Why does it stop? You'd like to think that people just finally realized that slavery was really bad, but one of the things that stopped slavery in the New World was it all of a sudden wasn't as profitable because it's very expensive to basically, force people into slavery halfway across the world. But sugar made it profitable. But in the 1830s, 1840s, countries like Germany that did not have colonies in the Caribbean wanted a way to make sugar that they could afford. And so a German chemist developed a way to make sugar from beets, these little red plants that you grow underground like potatoes, and sugar beets. And it's cheaper than sugarcane. And doing this basically destroys the market for sugar because now here's a cheaper way to grow sugar. You can grow it in Europe. You don't need to ship it across the world. And all of a sudden, the industry of slavery that feeds the sugar plantations begins to die off. It's not as profitable. And in the 1840s and 50s, many islands, many countries started to free their slaves. So these global markets shape things far away around the world. The von Thunen model is this attempt to explain economic activity and land use. So von Thunen, I like saying his name, he was a German geographer. He was looking at markets and agricultural production. So not so much making cars, but looking at farming. And he wanted to make a model that said, given a city is located here, if a city is here and there's a river to the city, some hypothetical city, right? What type of value and land use will this area have? So this is a predictive model. This isn't an actual city. And what he said was that the closer you got to the middle of a city, this urban center, the more expensive land would be, which means that the land use would be more intensive to justify that cost, right? And that the further you got from the center of the city, the less expensive the land was, so land use would drop. So this is talking about farms, but let me put this in terms we can understand. Imagine this red dot is downtown Chicago. Now, most of you probably know that in Chicago, right, the closer you are to downtown, right, or the closer you are to the lakefront, the more your rent is, right? If you want to rent an apartment near the school here in downtown Chicago, I believe a studio goes for a couple thousand a month. Whereas if you rent up in the north side or the south or the west side, it can be a lot lower. And why is that? More people want to be down there. Land costs more. So the people that build the apartment buildings have to pay more for the land, so they're going to charge more in rent, right? And so the further you get from downtown or the lake, the less the apartments cost. And that's the same idea, right? Think about it. Why do we only see skyscrapers and really tall high-rise apartment buildings downtown on the lakefront? Because it's very expensive to build those. And so if you're going to spend a couple $1,000,000 to build this big, huge apartment building, then you expect to be able to get the money back from high rents. That's why you don't see really tall apartment buildings out on the west, south, and east sides, far away from the downtown. The value that you get from the rent isn't as high. Okay? Trust me, there are many other reasons rents are lower in other parts of the city, but that's the basis for this model. He also says if there's an easy method of transportation to the city center, proximity to that will make things more expensive. And so think about the train lines. If you live close to a train line like the L, the red or green or brown line, usually the closer you live to the train line makes your rent a little higher because it's an easier commute for you. So imagine this would be a train line. Same idea. And this is just kind of a blown up version of that. Couple things to talk about. This is a hypothetical model. This is a predictive model. This isn't an actual city. This just says, given these features, right? If a city is here, you would use this model to predict certain things. In this case, land value. So this doesn't account for local variations. For instance, again, right, Chicago has a lakefront. This has no lakefront. Doesn't account for that. Okay. What are some applications that we've used? Well, this actually does apply to how cities have developed. We're going to talk later in the semester about the idea of megalopolis, a large city on the East Coast. This perfectly applies to megalopolis. And it's been used by many scientists to study how land changes, how land use has changed over time. All right, I'm going to pause with Van Thunen for you to all get up and stretch out the cellies and take a little break, and then we'll be back with part 2 for chapter 7 in just a moment.